Good morning. My name is Stefania Wilks. I'm a graduate student at the University of Utah in the United States, where I just completed my master's degree, and I am preparing to begin work on a doctoral thesis. I'm a research assistant to Dr. Lisbeth Lauterbach in the Archaeobotanical Laboratory at the Natural History Museum of Utah. My research includes modern and ancient starch and pollen analysis in the arid West and Colorado Plateau of North America. The research I'm presenting today is on starch grain morphology and water stress in Zea mays. Water is arguably the most important resource for successful crop production in the Southwest. Moisture during the growing season is essential and often the most important constraint on the quantity and quality of an agricultural harvest. Less moisture during the early stages limits the growth and the development of both the shoot and root systems. Chronic moisture deficits during reproduction stages produces essentially infertile plants and therefore a meager harvest. For farmers, the number of crops harvested is the benefit of farming, and the effort expended on obtaining that harvest determines the cost. If everything is equal, then evidence of water stress means low return for farming, low harvest. Water stress affects the size and morphology of maize kernels, even if the adult plant survives to maturity. Permanent sources of water offer a relatively low-risk strategy with respect to minimizing your water stress in crops, whereas irrigation techniques that rely on capturing rainfall are dependent on the frequency and duration of precipitation occurring at the right location. And I like this picture. In this picture you can see some of the monsoonal rains that these crops are so dependent on falling a mile away from the field where they're actually being needed. In the arid Southwest, the role of irrigation in growing maize is an essential parameter in many foraging models. Irrigation farming requires modifications and investments in surface features that will move or control incoming water. Construction and management of features designed to move, direct, or control intermittent or permanent surface water can be costly. Ethnographically, the costs associated with these techniques vary from minimal to intensive through a combination of various strategies. For example, minimal investment in irrigation may include branches placed in shallow intermittent drainage to spread occasional surface water from storms, whereas high investment could include terracing hillsides or building massive canal systems to move water from rivers to distant fields. Significant relationships between drought and reduced maize yield and kernel size are well documented. Very little work, however, has been conducted on how the size and morphology of starch granules stored in those kernels might change as a function of water stress during the growing season. Irrigation experiments at the Range Creek Field Station replicate the simple surface diversion techniques documented at several prehistoric Fremont archaeological sites in Utah, and are particularly focused on measuring the costs, or the labor, and the benefits of the maize yields of simple irrigation farming. The goal of the field station is to examine the adaptations of arid land foragers and farmers through paleo-environmental, experimental, and archaeological lines of evidence. Since little is known about the farming techniques used by the ancient Fremont, experiments conducted at the field station examine the economic trade-offs related to dry versus irrigation farming, documented both archaeologically and ethnographically throughout the Southwest. These experiments documented the differences of maize yield, or the number of cobs, and the number and size of kernels on each cob as a function of water stress resulting from different amounts of irrigation water. The site location for the population of maize that we tested for this research was in Range Creek Canyon, Utah. They were grown in experimental gardens at the Range Creek Field School. As you can see, the canyon is dry and rugged like much of the Southwest. The field station is located in the Book Cliffs along the Tavaputs Plateau, which is 40 miles southeast of Price, about 60 miles north of Moab, if you're familiar with that. Human populations of the ancient Fremont culture flourished in the canyon 8900 to 1200. They were hunter-gatherers who also farmed maize and stored numerous cobs in granaries tucked in the sandstone cliffs throughout the canyon. The goal of the field station is to examine the adaptations of these farmers, since little is known about their techniques. Our study sought to determine whether there are significant changes in the size or morphology of starch grain from the maize that was planted at Range Creek Field Station under two different irrigation regimes: very little water, once every 3 weeks, to ample water, once every day. The maize chosen for the experiment was an heirloom variety of Tohono O'odham 60 days because of its short growing season compared to other Native American maize land races. 6 plots of Tohono O'odham 60-day maize with different watering schedules were planted in the Range Creek experiment, with each of the 12 growing basins containing 4 seeds. For the purposes of this study, we selected plot 2, which was watered once every 3 weeks, and plot 6, which was watered every day. Plot 1, which was not irrigated, did not produce sufficient maize cobs or kernels for our analysis. What is starch? Starch is an energetically important polymer of glucose produced as a byproduct of photosynthesis, and it's located in most plant tissues. The granules I look at are produced in large quantities in storage organs, including many of the seeds, grains, nuts, roots, tubers, and rhizomes that are staples of human diet or were a component of past subsistence strategies. Starch granule morphology varies depending on botanical origin, and it may be used to differentiate between family genera and even species. Some starch granules grow loosely, as you can see. Some are bimodal in size. Others, like the maize starch granule, develop in close proximity to one another, and this affects their 3-dimensional shape. This is not uncommon in seed starch granules. Archaeological starch granules are identified by carefully examining a range of morphological, dimensional, and optical features under different microscope lighting conditions and comparing them with granules from modern reference collections. Typical identifying maize starch granule morphology includes 2-dimensional silhouette of irregular shape, not circular, not angular. Other distinct attributes include granule size range and commonly expressed fissures like the bisecting transverse fissure or a 3-armed to 5-armed stellate fissure, and the less common radial fissure expressed in a pie-shaped wedge, all originating from the hilum. And the hilum is the center, the point of origination, where it begins to grow. Our research shows that water stress affects the size and morphology of starch granules within the maize kernels. This study demonstrates that the size of maize starch granules reflects the amount of moisture that the parent plant receives, and therefore is a function of water stress during the growing season. Remember, moisture in the growing season is essential and often the most important constraint on the quantity and quality of an agricultural harvest. Starch granule size is, therefore, a potentially important environmental and archaeological proxy because it can evaluate the relative performance of prehistoric farming in a specific place and time, and it can serve as another piece of evidence in understanding the role of irrigation in the past. The size distribution from the high water plot 6 was significantly skewed towards larger granules when compared to the distribution of the low water plots, plot 2. The size differences are especially apparent in the upper 20%. What we also found out was that fissures or defining qualities and characteristics of the starch granule are more likely to be evident in the larger granules. The implications for interpretation of archaeological and paleoenvironmental records are obvious. Water stress in maize results in fewer cobs, fewer kernels per cob, and generally smaller kernels. In the arid and semi-arid regions of North America, especially those marked with interannual variation in growing season precipitation, starch granules larger than 20 microns, ZMA starch granules larger than 20 microns, could potentially indicate access to ample water. This is important because irrigation is often very difficult to identify in the archaeological record due to its inconspicuous and ephemeral material consequences. This study has implications for identifying archaeological maize and determining past farming investment strategies. Thank you.